Have you ever messed something up so catastrophically that there's just no chance at redemption? Yeah, me neither, but I have definitely made mistakes, so today we're going to be addressing and correcting a big one. Back in November of 2025, I put out a little 20-page adventure zine called Reciprocity, which, as the cover will tell you, is an adventure for level 4 to 6 characters. This was the first time I'd ever made something like this, and I did everything other than the artwork myself, from layout to adventure design to creature stat blocks. And while 20 pages might seem like a lot, it's really not. So I had to cram as much information and style onto every page as I could, which is why on the inside cover of the zine, there are some NPC names, rules for traversing the hex crawl portion of the adventure, and a D6 random encounter table, which is where I messed up. You might look at this table and think, well this looks like a perfectly fine random encounter table to me, and it would be, if it weren't for the fact that the third option you can roll doesn't exist anywhere inside of the adventure. It's kind of hard to throw 1d4 Lightkeepers up against your party when they don't exist, isn't it? So how did this happen? Well, basically I had this idea for a creature I wanted to include in the adventure. I set that idea aside, and then I hit 20 pages exactly with no wiggle room remaining, and I completely forgot about the Lightkeepers altogether. The playtesters just happened to not roll a 3 on this table, I guess, because nobody I sent this to ahead of the release said anything to me, and the only reason I even noticed this was because I was running the module at a convention, and I rolled on the encounter table and just kind of stared at the page for 5 full seconds, realizing that I had rolled a 3 and the Lightkeepers were cut for space. So today I am going to rectify this mistake by creating a wholly original D&D monster and finally bringing the Lightkeepers into, well, the light. And because I'm doing this as a standalone monster who isn't specifically part of Reciprocity, I'm going to create them in such a way that they can be useful to any GM, not just someone who's running my adventure. So settle in, because we've got some work to do. First things first. What even is a Lightkeeper? Well, the general premise of Reciprocity is that 333 years ago, there was an inciting event in a primordial forest known as the Lord's Coppice. A group of adventurers were using a very powerful magic item to destroy a lich. That item was a lantern which housed the soul of a phoenix, however things went wrong and it worked a little bit too good, so while the lich was indeed destroyed, so too were the adventurers and everything within a few miles. Thus began the Shining Plague, a horrible condition akin to radiation poisoning that swept the rest of the forest, causing sickness, death, and mutations in all living things. The Lord's Coppice is basically magical Chernobyl after a bunch of yahoos set off a tiny celestial nuke, and the only reason the 3 villages in the adventure are still around is because each one of them made a pact with an archfey to protect themselves from the ravages of the Shining Plague. There's a bit more to that story, of course, but that's the short version and all the setup you really need to understand the Lightkeepers. Initially, my idea was that there would be a secret 4th village to the north who rejected the archfey's proposal, and rather than give him what they wanted, this 4th village chose to tough out the Shining Plague on their own. Needless to say, it didn't go super well. Most of them died, and the village fell to ruin, and the few of them who managed to endure have had their mind and body slowly twisted into monstrous creatures. These creatures would come to call themselves Lightkeepers, and they would devote themselves wholly to the radiant light that created them. Visually, I wanted them to appear as these little mutant moth guys, so I had our resident artist Tam draw up some art depicting them as such. I love this art. It's got a real fantasy Jawa Hollow Knight thing going on with their fuzzy little antenna, of course, poking out from the hood. It's great. In the adventure, they are meant to be these weird little cultists who might work with the party or be a hindrance depending on what they think you're trying to do. Their whole thing is being devoted to the shining light at the epicenter of where this magical catastrophe took place, so if they think you're headed there to seek the light, they might help you out. If they think you're going there to try and snuff it out or end the Shining Plague in some way, they will probably try to snuff you out first. But beyond the scope of this adventure, I think these creatures have a lot of potential to be another weird little guy for your GM roster. With this larger scope in mind, I wrote them to be completely obsessed with all magical sources of light. As a species, they are drawn to magical light sources and often seek out magical light sources so that they can serve as protectors of those light sources. We're talking anything from giant glowing crystals to magic items charged with enough radiant energy to nuke a forest. When they find a great source of magical light, they will often build a temple to show reverence to the light and also as a way of protecting it. If, say, they find a giant luminous crystal in the Underdark, they're likely to build a temple around this crystal to easily protect it from damage and potential thieves. The Lightkeepers also carry around these little magical lanterns, which are basically just hooded lanterns from the 5e equipment list, but they are magical and thus don't require burning oil. As beings who revere the light so intensely, it's only natural that they should also hate the dark, so I made sure to give them a few traits that play with this idea along with their light-keeping ways. I mean, if we're gonna lead into the light-worshipping moth people, let's go all the way. But you know who else keeps it light? This week's sponsor, FlexiSpot. When FlexiSpot reached out to me about sponsoring the channel, I was stoked because my old bed frame squealed like a banshee anytime you moved even a little bit, and it was so wobbly. So when they agreed to send me one of their Japanese joinery bed frames with the promise that it would be squeak-free and sturdy, I was both excited and curious to see if it would hold up. And I gotta say, I've been sleeping on this thing for a couple months now, and it hasn't budged an inch. I've got 2 dogs, and those dogs be jumping on and off the bed all through the night. It is what it is. I also move around in my sleep like a crazy amount. Seriously, I don't know what I'm getting up to after I pass out, but if I had to guess, I'd say it's some kind of nocturnal combat sport. And through all of that, silence. This is due to the bed frame's interlocking joints, which are less susceptible to getting yanked around and coming loose like more conventional construction might be. They're also made with rubber wood, which makes them super durable and scratch resistant. And while I wouldn't part with this bed frame for anything less than a cool million big ones, FlexiSpot is selling these bad boys for extremely reasonable prices. They also offer tons of customization options, so you can go as minimal or as maximal as you want. If you're in the market for a new bed frame that's lightweight, durable, silent as the grave, and gives you some sweet storage space underneath the frame itself, check out the link in the description down below and get yourself some good sleep. Seriously, I won't shut up about this thing. I've unironically convinced at least 2 friends to order one. They're unreal. Anyways, thank you so much to FlexiSpot for bringing us here to talk about weird little moth guys. Now, as for those little moth guys in question, I wanted them to be about CR3. So I gave them some stats and hit points in line with that goal, and then of course, made them immune to radiant damage and the poison condition, since they will be in an irradiated forest within my adventure. To really sell the light-seeking moth behavior of this creature, I chose not to give them dark vision, so that way they would need to use light to navigate through the darkness. I also gave them a trait called Luminous Vigor that is more or less pack tactics, except it provides advantage on their attack rolls against creatures in bright light. When it comes to actions, I figured these creatures would be more on the magic side of things rather than the martial side, so I gave them a simple dagger attack and some spells. Dancing Lights and Light are mostly there for flavor reasons, however, Guiding Bolt and Divine Smite both ensure that they have 1 solid melee attack and 1 solid ranged attack option. Granted, both are limited to 3 times per day, so they can't keep that going forever. I also gave them Daylight, Fairy Fire, and Moonbeam as once per day spell options to continue our theme of magical light spells, and give them a couple of potentially very impactful spells relative to their CR. Lastly, I wanted to give them a little spice, something to make the stat block feel truly unique, so that's where Panicked Swipes comes in. Panicked Swipes is a bonus action that they can only use in an area of darkness, which they hate. If they're in an area of darkness, the Lightkeepers can make a dagger attack at a random target and move up to half their speed in a random direction without provoking opportunity attacks. And there we have it. A pretty simple CR3 creature who worships sources of magical light. But of course, now with theoretically unlimited space, I got to thinking. And that led me to creating another stat block called the Lightkeeper Priest, who is a CR6 powered up version of this creature. Overall, their core abilities are all the same, however, they also have a trait that emits bright light all around them, and they trade in that dagger for a cool staff that deals radiant damage. They also got some magic healing and 2 new once per day spells in both Sunbeam and Flame Strike. If you're unfamiliar, Sunbeam and Flame Strike are 2 big AoE spells that deal a ton of radiant damage in a line and an area respectively, so probably best to not upset the Moth Priest. I also gave him a reaction called Stifle the Dark, which is counterspell, but it can only be used against someone casting a spell that creates magical darkness, such as darkness. I also went ahead and created rules for a Lightkeeper lair and what that might look like. I figured since they're all about building temples around shiny magic objects, a lair that creates light in the area, prevents magical darkness from creeping in, and deals radiant damage to anyone who long rests within its walls seemed pretty cool. So now, with 2 stat blocks and some layer actions, I feel like this creature is truly ready to work within the original adventure, but also to go beyond its walls into the larger world of Dungeons & Dragons. They grow up so fast. Speaking of which, how might you use these little mysterious Mothmen in a D&D game? I'm glad you asked. While originally created as monstrosities who are obsessed with magic light, I think you could very easily run these guys as Fey creatures too. They could be servants of a Fey court where the Archfey is some kind of shining and luminous being whose domain is constantly bathed in light. Or maybe they are even subjugated by a gloaming Fey lord who keeps them in darkness and uses their obsession with light to reward them for doing the Archfey's bidding. In that same vein, I think they could weirdly work really well as minions for a dragon. Whether they are good or evil is going to depend a lot on the dragon they serve, but any dragon who can create brilliant flames with their breath is sure to be revered by these little creatures. Doubly so if it's a dragon with a radiant breath weapon. And on the topic of fire, if you want to use them as bad guys, perhaps a particularly unhinged Lightkeeper priest has started setting fire to everything in a given area simply to bask in the brilliant flames. That could make for a great group of weird cultists that may provide something a little different for veteran players. On a much smaller scale, a Lightkeeper on their own could make for an interesting NPC encounter. Perhaps they're lost in a dark forest or within the bowels of a cave system and the party is venturing through the area. Ever since losing their lantern, they've just been in panic mode for the past little while, and upon seeing the party coming through with torches or whatever light source they're carrying, the Lightkeeper finds and asks them for help. Or maybe it just follows them, regardless of if they want to help or not. If you want to bring organized religion into it, maybe the Lightkeepers in your world are actually dedicated to a proper god of light, and they tend to that deity's temples. It could be kind of interesting to roll into a temple of Pelor, only to find a bunch of weird little moth guys milling about, just to mix things up. But however you choose to use these creatures, as always, linked in the description down below, there is a Google document which contains all their game lore and information, so you can use them at your game table for free. And to all of my lovely patrons out there who are watching right now, you can find them over on the Dungeon Dad Patreon page in the form of a high-res PDF stat block, which is the same game information, but a bit more fanciful presentation is my way of saying thank you for those of you who throw me a few extra bucks each month to keep this train going. Speaking of keeping this train going, whether you are on Patreon or not, if you want to pick up a copy of my adventure zine and give it a go for yourself with Lightkeepers now included, you can find a link to that in the description down below as well on my merch shop where I got t-shirts and other stuff too, but that is where you will find the zine. It is available physically as well as a PDF, whatever floats your boat, suits your fancy. And you can run it there and let me know what you think. I also want to give a massive shout out to this week's randomly selected patron of the week. Thank you so much to Thunderstep for the 3D10 of support you send my way every month. And thank you for watching. As always, if there's a monster from an older edition of D&D or just a general concept you have for a creature that you think would be cool, let me know in the comments down below or in the Dungeon Dad Discord creature suggestions channel. And who knows, you might just see it show up in a future episode of Monster of the Week. In any case, that is all I got for you today. Once again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week. Until then.